It's hot out there, and it's about to get hot in here. So we are talking about the third of the big H's.
Which is,
who are the other two? Hegel?
There's like four of them, maybe. Well, Hume is a minor, but
Hume is
Hegel, Husserl, and Heidegger. Yeah, Hume. Kant like fucked Hume backwards, so Hume was out of the academy until like, I don't know, until Deleuze was writing. Yeah, until Deleuze did his like dissertation on him, and Deleuze made pragmatism fashionable for the French nerds.
You could always do like Hume, Herodotus, and Helmholtz or something like that.
Yeah,
the minor H's.
The minor H's, yeah.
Today we're doing the major H's.
Yeah.
Have you guys read Husserl lately? I remember like getting off on it when I first was reading it, and now it's just way too friggin' boring.
Last time I like seriously read it was like 2013, 14 when I went through like his European Sciences book.
I think I read some back in my master's in philosophy in like a reading group. Yeah, that was probably like 2012 or something.
I got most of my Husserl secondhand.
A boring ass writer.
He is really boring. Yeah, that's I think part of the reason I've never gone back to it.
I don't think he's obligated to entertain us though, especially based on his subject matter. He's not gonna be like, here's the subject object division. Woo woo!
Eric, there's a fucking million different streaming channels provided with all the goddamn content I want, and at least 10 billion porn sites out there. Okay, I need something better than like, well, just deuce the transcendental ego from pure experience. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry.
The triangle of the noetic, the nomadic. And the nuance.
What if we had Eric narrate it and make an audiobook for you of it? Would that make it better?
I mean, maybe. That could compel me, yeah. I still have to read The Phenomenology of Perception.
Now we learn about the epoche. Everyone clear your minds.
That was before the radio, so they didn't know how to do stuff interesting yet.
True enough.
The epoche is Husserl.
Yeah, it is. No, I think that was something that Matt said was... Ponte.
The phenomenology of perception.
Yeah, no, I'm gonna finish reading.
Yeah, that's the Ponster. It's because
Well, I'm gonna need that back because I'm gonna do a video on it.
When do you need it back?
Are you doing a Merleau-Ponty video?
With you.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah.
When do you need it back by?
I don't know. I'd
put all that
rather
reading.
read Invisible. It's more interesting. Anyway.
Put all that reading to work
in January or something. Yeah.
Oh, that's fine. I was just gonna say because I was gonna read one more book and then get to it, so that should be fine.
The flesh.
Every philosopher's boring. You gotta make them fun. You gotta be interested in what they have to say, and then That's
not true. Like fucking Kierkegaard's not boring at all. Kierkegaard's literally like, I dumped my wife. Here are the reasons why. And now let me explain to you why everyone hates me, but they're wrong.
And then 65 pages on Job, which is not exciting.
I mean, that's interesting because it's just like, God basically just decided like, oh, this guy's a really good person. And then Satan's like, well, why don't we punish him? And God's like, fuck yeah, let's do it.
Well, the Bible's boring as shit, but it's shaped everything for the last 2,000 years.
I don't think Job is
the Bible is not the First Testament's good.
Oh, the ideas are fine, but when you actually read it, like, and thus spoke Mark to Matthew.
That is true.
Well, I'm down with like
speak to each other.
King David went to the Philistines, killed like 600 of them, and cut their foreskins
and
off.
Isaac begat Isaac, and Isaac begat Sosak, and Sosak begot Brock, and Brock begot, and then that's like 50 pages later you finish Genesis. What a fucking ride.
That is boring. I'll give you that. But like Job is literally that. Like it's a fascinating book because like it's basically exactly what I described. Satan goes up to God and is basically like, I want to fucking punish this guy because he's been really good, and I want to show that everyone can fall. And God's like, well, why not? Let's run the experiment. And Job complains, and he's like, why did you do this to me, Lord? And God eventually just has no answer for him except for like, you do what I say, you little fucking punk. You know what I mean? Like, who are you to question me? And then God's like, but you know what? You're right. Like, it's a very, very weird story. So,
all right. So welcome to the Pill Pod.
Oh yeah, we're recording.
We've actually mentioned a few key terms that define Heidegger's early life. Kierkegaard, and he was training to be a priest, I think.
Husserl, phenomenology.
I don't know how many German Catholics there were, but he was one of them.
There's loads of.
If I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
This is going out of my memory bank.
Was he Catholic?
He was, yeah.
I think he was a Jesuit. No?
He was trained to be part of the Roman Catholic priesthood. I'm not sure if he was training in the Jesuit order, but his early research was on mathematics. Then he switched to a kind of scholastic Aristotelianism.
I would have assumed he's Protestant because that's what Germany, Martin Luther, Protestants.
No, actually,
you could safely assume that for most, but Heidegger was an exception.
Weird.
Yeah. And actually, you kind of see that also because Protestant theology at the time, people like Paul Tillich, who was inspired by Heidegger, sometimes has a bit of a conservative edge to it, but it's much more willing to embrace elements of modernity. The kind of German Catholicism that he came out of is a lot more hostile to modernity, just wholesale, right? And that attitude never really left him.
I think.
Well, he seems to have missed the guilt train too, which is.
I think
that's true.
You like the best place you could probably go for a philosophy education throughout a lot of Europe was to a seminary to be instructed by, I don't know, whatever religious teachers who would teach you Latin and Greek and how to read the Bible. And
yeah.
Then Hegel was obviously a seminarian too, and so were a lot of the German idealists who Heidegger tries to, I don't know, overcome, as they say.
So we are biting off a lot and just seeing how it goes. We might have to do 2 episodes on this, but Heidegger, existentialist, phenomenologist, hermeneutician, not sure if that's a word, and then whatever you call later Heidegger. Did I miss anything?
Nazi?
Yeah, he turns into like a Nazi. Yeah,
I think we should. I think we can ignore that for this episode. We've done enough on that shit.
Well, we're not going to talk about it, but we can acknowledge it. Yeah, we can. We've already talked about that plenty. I mean, I could say Heidegger becomes like some kind of a weird spiritual mystic, kind of in some of his later work. I don't know if you guys would agree with that, but that seems like
what do they call him? Like the Hermit of Marburg or something like that. You know.
Well, he never really abandons like his central project of trying to understand this question of being that he comes up with as like this sort of revolutionary avenue of inquiry in philosophy to question just like what is being, or as Bill Clinton put it two decades ago, what your definition of is.
It depends upon what the meaning of the word is. Yes.
Heidegger was all about what is. I don't know. Maybe that was Heidegger's defense. Is you a Nazi, Heidegger? Well, it depends what is. Were you fucking Monica Lewinsky?
That was brilliant.
Yeah, was it Clinton or Heidegger who said language is the house of being? I can't remember.
The White House of Being, I think it was.
The White House of Being, yeah.
It's in Washington.
Clinton, yeah.
That was the Oval Office of Being.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's the circle of the clearing where being comes in.
I have to say, I think that was my favorite open ever, Eric. That was fucking, great.
All right, so we're going to have to take this slow. Try not to name drop. Try not to term drop, I guess, might be more important in this episode. But we could start with, like, what's the import of Heidegger despite him being a Nazi?
Yeah.
Yeah,
he's arguably the most important philosopher of the 20th century, so he's got that going for him. He's one of the votes alongside Wittgenstein's Logical Tractatus for having one of the most important books.
Yeah, I'd say those are really the only 2 competitors if you look at like formal philosophy, right? You might also be able to throw in Foucault in contention if you're looking at just like sheer influence, citations, all that kind of stuff.
Well, Foucault was a Heideggerian. He said, apparently, according to Hubert Dreyfus, who is a leading phenomenologist, he said Foucault on his deathbed said his whole oeuvre has been basically a response to Heidegger in many ways.
But he also said I'm a Nietzschean, and then said like we need to return to Kant. So
Heidegger was a Nietzschean too.
Foucault was into polyamory when it came to the history of ideas, right? It was always like, yeah, I'm with you, baby. Whenever he was with, in the room with them, but he would change his tune when he was with somebody else.
Because Nietzsche was like a challenge to all philosophy before him. Like Nietzsche is the first guy to start this like movement of overcoming the metaphysical tradition, and Heidegger saw himself as like continuing that project. So I think a lot of these new thinkers like Derrida and Foucault get their interest in Nietzsche in a large part through Heidegger.
Yeah, I'd probably say that's right.
And the way Heidegger uses Nietzsche.
And Heidegger wrote more on Nietzsche than anybody else.
Yeah,
I didn't
By
know
4
that.
volumes is pretty impressive.
Massive books. And it was almost exclusively on Will to Power as well, which was an unfinished book.
And the Eternal Current. Oh, you mean the book? Yeah, okay. I was going to say the two big things in those volumes are Will to Power and the Eternal Recurrence. But yeah.
So I don't know,
But
maybe-
in terms of outgrowth, there is, Heidegger the existentialist, which becomes manifest in French, Sartre, and then in phenomenology with Merleau-Ponty, with the hermeneutic turn in Derrida. So you could say he kind of inspired his many ideas inspired a whole generation of French thinkers to pick up and walk in different directions.
And and of course, Being in Time, right? His like early magnum opus is a response to, and like he saw it at least initially as a continuation of Husserl's work, who I think he studied under at the university. So he does start off. I mean, Husserl, of course, being the first phenomenologist to call himself that in the sense that we would mean it today, at least. Of course, there was like Hegel talking about the phenomenology of spirit, but in the sense we would mean it today, Husserl was the first. And to some extent, Heidegger was trying to continue that phenomenological tradition that Husserl started, but he wanted to focus the analysis on a more fundamental ontological question in Being in Time, which is like the question of being ultimately. But I think the method he's using in the book in Being in Time is largely inspired by phenomenology. His analysis of Dasein, right, which is just the word he uses for human being or subjectivity or something like that. Dasein is I think largely a phenomenological method.
Yeah.
I think that's a good place to start. But why don't we start with the difference between Husserl and Heidegger?
I just wanted to point out, as a matter of technical clarification, he actually dedicated the early version of Being in Time to Husserl. He withdrew the dedication actually during the Nazi era because Husserl was Jewish. Took a lot of flack for that, although he apologized for it by saying, well, there are still references to Husserlian phenomenology through the footnotes that were kind of...
Of course, because Husserl was Jewish.
Yeah, exactly. But apparently it broke the old man's heart, right? Like Husserl was really sad since he considered Heidegger to be his kind of protege going out there carrying on the project. And when he broke with him because of Nazism. Yeah, there you go.
I've got it right here. Actually, in this translation, the Stombaugh translation, this one with the leaves on it, it does say, dedicated to Edmund Husserl in admiration and friendship, April 8th to 1926.
Yeah, well, it was restored after, the Nazi Revolution, right? Probably wise, actually.
So there's a lot of terms that came up there. Yeah, like fundamental ontology. I mean, the difference, let's go for the difference between Heidegger and Husserl. The easiest way to talk about it is that Husserl could be called a descriptive phenomenologist, whereas Heidegger would be classified as a hermeneutic phenomenologist. So Husserl's idea was, well, phenomenology for him was in the service of science, right? So to help scientists describe the world's in a more attentive and minute kind of way, which would then help them out. Like I'm not a big Husserl scholar. I don't think any of us are. But Heidegger came in with hermeneutics because he's all about the meaning of being, right? So you'll see things like the question of the meaning of being all over his work. And that's because it's interpretive work. And what is hermeneutics? Well, that evolved out of the biblical tradition. So that goes back to his sort of seminary training. It's the biblical tradition of hermeneutics, where you would figure out ways to interpret the Bible. And he brought hermeneutics into phenomenology. So that's probably the biggest difference you can just with terminology.
And you can see it right in the table of contents, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, he starts with the question of the meaning of being, right? So meaning obviously is like the starting point, right? So there's obviously a hermeneutical starting point. But yeah, Pills, go ahead.
Your heuristic for understanding hermeneutics is the hermeneutic circle, which I think is a term that you may have heard before. But it just means that the reader has like a horizon of meaning, a set of understandings that they get. Then they read a text. That text changes their understanding. Then when they read that text again, there's a circle going on. So it's affective. And I think this comes from Schleiermacher because he's talking about, you read the Bible and the Bible inspires you to change your view of the world. But then you also change your reading of theology or biblical literature.
Yeah, there's a certain sense of interpretation also being sort of just like a basic thing we do as well in this like hermeneutic circle, because we have a bunch of assumptions about reality, which is kind of our like natural ontology, I guess, which is given to us in the way we're brought up and socialized, and we
common sense, you might call it.
Well, yeah, sort of. Except it's common sense, but it's a sort of also for Heidegger, it's like a lack of critical reflection as well. You just make all these assumptions, so it's like go out and like try to just like perform the thought of experiment of trying to look at something and not know it for what it is. Like go out, look at an exit sign and try to just like not know already that it's an exit sign directing you outside. Interpretation is so fundamental to our experience of the world that he wants to get underneath these assumptions we make that go into our interpretation and try to open up what he would call, I guess, new ontologies, like different assumptions about what the world is, what it's made of, what science tells us about the world, where the whole idea of subject-object divide, for example, is an ontological frame that's been pretty dominant right up until Heidegger, is that,
Right.
Humans are subjects and the world appears as objects opposed to subjects. And that's sort of how, so you have to sort of get rid of your biases and your subjective opinions, and you just have to see the world the way it is, objectively. And that's been the sort of, I think that's developed in philosophy pretty much since Descartes. Since Descartes called us
even since Plato in some ways.
Yeah. Descartes in many ways is, obviously he's pushing this forward into a dualist ontology where there's two types of things. There's thinking things, which become subjects, and there's extended things, which Aristotle called substances, which we now call objects. And Heidegger wants to just get rid of all of that shit. He thinks it's all just hiding more fundamental questions that we can actually get to.
Well, this is actually where I want to bring up the kind of existential dimension to his thought and how I think it links both the hermeneutic and phenomenological elements of the Heideggerian project, at least the early Heideggerian project, right? So I think that the way that he kind of distances himself from Husserl is in two ways, right? Husserl kind of perpetuates this very modernist project of trying to look at the rational conditions for any kind of experience in the same way that Descartes and Kant were trying to do, except that he says that he has a more accurate way of engaging this by allowing things to appear as they really appear to the conscious ego, right? And one of the things that Heidegger says right from the very beginning of this book, which I think is quite striking, is that this presupposes that the first thing that we do is engage in conscious activity that's directed rationalistically towards the world. And later on, he criticizes this by distinguishing between philosophy and thinking, right? And kind of philosophical rationalization and our everyday experience of the world. Because he says, no, what's foundational to Dasein isn't actually reason. It's care. That's what he calls our structural primordiality, right? And he says the fact that we care about the world and in fact must care about the world is what invests it with a kind of meaning that opens it up for various possible interpretations depending upon what our goals and ambitions are, right? So if I look at a hammer and just see it as a collection of geometric shapes to be analyzed in this Euclidean manner, or even in a more materialistic fashion as a bit of matter that's composed and articulated in a certain way, I don't really understand the meaning of this hammer as it would appear to somebody who cares, for instance, about being a carpenter, which is something he writes about a lot, right? Who would look at this much more as a tool to be used in a certain way because they're invested in a certain project that gives their life meaning, right? And this, in the early 20th century, was just a radically innovative way of thinking about things. And it's not just a radically innovative way of thinking about things, but I think it's a very powerful way of thinking about things. Because one of the points that was made by Herbert Dreyfus, right, is like, well, look at, if you ask yourself, are we beings who think or are we beings who care more, the very first act that we engage in when we come out of the womb is to cry out, signifying the fact that we're invested in this life and thrown into it without any kind of sense or reason given behind this existence, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that prefigures any of the kind of conscious rationalizations that we engage in.
Yeah,
it's probably good to note that he's not using these words in like the everyday sense too. So care doesn't really mean, you know, just like a sort of affective attachment to things. It doesn't really mean that for Heidegger.
No, right.
I think the German is besorgen, but he tries to find a whole new terminology, because the other problem with metaphysics, which he's trying to get out of, is that all the language has been passed down to us and all the language is insufficient. So Heidegger needs to come up with completely new terms, which is part of why reading him is maddening and translating him is ridiculously hard. And also he takes old words and uses them in very completely new ways. So there's that double problem of inventing words and taking words out of their traditional sense and just using them in a totally different way.
Yeah, so he reappropriates a bunch of words. And care, you're right. I think care is a good example of something that I always read as meaning like kind of that there's a significance to things, like that is like a defining feature that like and it's also defined, like care is also a name he gives, I think, to like that threefold relationship of what Dasein is in, right? So like the fact that Dasein is projected forwards towards its projects, the fact that Dasein is like thrown into the world like unknowingly, and the fact that like Dasein is always relating to like what happened before it. Like there's like that threefold. There's like a temporal. That's where like the time part and being in time comes in, right? It's like there's that threefold aspects of Dasein, which together I think does define for Heidegger Dasein as care, projectedness, thrownness, and I forget what the one is for like backwards looking, but like but those things, like the fact that there's an awareness of that those things are all the way Dasein orients itself to the world is what he means by care, as I understand it.
If you want, there's a video that I did like 6 months ago. It explains each of the terms, including thrownness, care, in visual form, which is sometimes a little bit more easy to see. So we've done, I think, section 1, and I think it's great. I just want to simplify a little bit if I can. Because one thing that you all said correctly is that Husserl has a little bit of a mentalist or overly mental,
like a cognitivist kind of thing going.
Right, of like consciousness. So consciousness, and he is also trying to get rid of the divide between subject and object. But he has this idea of a consciousness of, so there's no consciousness in itself. You're always conscious of something. Mm-hmm. But what care adds to this is like you can be conscious of something and not care about it. And now I'm using it in the regular sense of caring. But when something means something to you, that's more than being conscious of it. So I want to move into the next section of being in time here in the Dasein part, because as you said, Matt, with the hammer, if you're a carpenter or whatever you're an expert at, if you're an expert at something, especially, then a hammer is going to mean something very different to you. You're not going to see it and be conscious of it. You're going to incorporate it into your body almost like it's a part of your arm. You might say the same thing with like a phone today or a keyboard today. We're not conscious of the keyboard. It just becomes incorporated into the way we interact with the world.
This is actually where I think it's so important to actually recognize what Victor was very rightly talking about, which is how it is that care is translated into temporal terms. And one of the things that Heidegger pushes very stringently against is the kind of Kantian Newtonian idea that time is experienced by us linearly, right, as a line, because he sees this as essentially locating us too much in the present, right? And even though, of course, there are certain things that are present at hand that we need to acknowledge, what he says is, of course...
Wait, can you explain the term?
Yeah, this is what I'm getting at, right? So basically...
You just said present at hand, though. Can you explain that term?
I'm going to get you, right? The kind of approach to time that he takes is what he calls ecstatic. And this later comes out in an essay he wrote called Time and Being, right? Where he says that, we are essentially determined in some ways by the historical past, which allows us to establish certain kind of projects in the present with what's present at hand, the kind of objects that appear to us. But of course, these objects only appear to us as what they're useful for because the projects that are determined by the past have resonance for us in our future hopes and expectations. Yeah. Right? We have to have something that we're using these tools for. And so in this sense, he says we need to understand time ecstatically. Because it's never just a linear moment, a linear experience of this moment, this moment, this moment, this moment. It's a much more holistic experience of time that allows things as they appear to us at the present to shine forth as what they are for us interpretively or hermeneutically.
To have a significance, right? They have to be. And I remember what the term was, like the backward looking is fallen. So like we're fallen, we're thrown, and we're projected forward. And there's an oscillation between all of these that make our experience possible. But I do kind of want to back up quickly because I feel like we maybe missed something important, which is just like how, like the fact that he's like the way he gets to an analytic of Dasein. I think it's just like worth mentioning that the way he does that is he starts right with the question of the meaning of being. And he decides through a couple of steps of reasoning that the only way to understand what the meaning of being is through an analytic of Dasein, which is like the human being. And then so like it starts off as like the meaning of being. But then he kind of what seems like sidetracked because he realizes the only way to answer the question is to analyze the thing that the meaning of being is an issue for, which is the human being. And then that leads him in to then start analyzing, well, what's Dasein? What is Dasein doing all the time? How is it defined? How can we understand its experience? And those are all, so I just thought it was worth mentioning to back up that relationship.
Yeah. And that's like realize too that phenomenology is not a sort of abstract analysis. It's kind of a minute accounting of our everyday engagement with the world. Like that's the whole idea of phenomenology for Husserl, or not for Husserl. For Husserl, it's for scientific purposes. For Heidegger, it's more, you got to go through Dasein's sort of what I think Dreyfus calls like a absorbed coping with the world, the way we deal with things on a daily basis.
The everydayness. Right? The everydayness. Yeah. Heidegger calls it the everydayness, right? And like that's, I think you have to get through it.
And that's so fundamental.
What's common though to Husserl and Heidegger is like, even though like I still think that what Heidegger's doing here at least is also very descriptive. Like it's if anything, it's excruciatingly descriptive because he's trying to describe like the minutia of how, like things have an everydayness, but like when you describe underneath that, when you like try to think about what makes that everydayness possible, what makes Dasein's experience possible, you start analyzing all these different structures by describing them. And you kind of, and I think that's what he's trying to do is like bring to the foreground what is actually in the background when we're kind of, preoccupied with our everydayness, with our regular commonsensical experience of the world. And we can see that what's making that common sense structure of our experience of Dasein is actually like these structures, like the fallenness, the thrownness, the project. These are the things that I think for him make it possible to have that thing. But then that thing, that commonsensical, that everydayness distracts us from the truth of those structures that make it possible.
Okay, I would know that we're all excited, but I can hear you guys talking. Everyone's excited. I need to keep jumping in here because I know we all know Heidegger really well, but I'm not expecting that everybody listening to us knows Heidegger really well.
For sure.
So if you want a heuristic again, you can think of Husserl as thinking of the most abstract, or not, it's not even abstract. It's descriptive in the sense of how does a mind, a consciousness experience the world. But he's thinking as if this is a scientist understanding the world. And the scientist already has, goals in place, and they're kind of lofty in terms of what the phenomenal object is, the object that appears. So they're already thinking, I guess you could say very rationally, very high-mindedly about their object. But what Heidegger wants to make his philosophy is not how the scientist thinks about object. We could call this present to hand, by the way, if you are familiar with being and time or words, vocabulary. But he wants to think about instead, how does a carpenter think about the world? Because they don't think about it. They're not using a scientific reasoning to think, okay, how's a hammer? How am I going to put this building together? They just know how to do it. And it's an embodied knowledge already.
Skilled.
So he's kind of getting phenomenology out of conscious mind scientific thought and putting it into an embodied sense. And you can see why this is really productive for philosophy later in the 20th century, because it's about everyday objects, not about scientific objects.
Yeah, and one of the examples I sometimes give is actually what I used to give actually when I was at Tech to Monterey is playing soccer, right? I mean, people might see playing soccer as very, simplistic, and you try to analyze it scientifically by saying like, wow, there's certain coordinated movements that these people making at a certain velocity, and they're clicking this plastic object, and the wind is going to have this kind of variable. But that's not the way that people experience it while playing soccer. What they actually experience it as is much more along the kind of ecstatic lines that Heidegger is talking about, right? Where they're thinking, this is what's come thus far. This is where we are in the game. What I have to do right now is kick this ball, because in the future, what I'm hoping is going to happen is this person is going to receive the ball and then they're going to kick it into the net, right? So if you break any of these kinds of way of experiencing the world into their discrete moments, the whole process becomes unclear to you. You need to understand it holistically as a practice throughout time to understand how it is that this person is experiencing it. But one of the things that I think is really innovative about what Heidegger does and really existential is there have been other Western philosophers who've had holistic visions of time, most of whom he doesn't particularly like, people like Bergson. You may even add Plato if you really wanted to, or Hegel.
Aristotle.
But he actually insists that even though time for us is ecstatic, what we still have to recognize is that the ecstatic period of time is finite. And it's the fact that we recognize that our period of time on this earth is finite that frames so many of our emotional outlooks, particularly our experience of things like angst being towards death, and so on, right?
So we should probably...
So, I might sit there and be playing a soccer game because I want to win, okay? But one of the reasons why it is that I want to win and I'm experiencing time holistically in the moment of playing this game is because I think to myself that my life has a certain finite end to it, and becoming a really good soccer player will help to give it a certain significance.
I don't think anyone's thinking of that, though. The point is that you don't think about that stuff.
Well, no,
right?
If you are a soccer player, though, you might, because that's what gives this game significance, and it's why you want to win the game. It's why you don't just sit there thinking to yourself, like, well, fuck it, whatever, right? It's just kicking a ball into an
All right, there's a couple points I want to add in here. I want to add a couple points in here, because we gotta talk about the main distinction between being singular and beings plural, or a being, right? So Heidegger thinks that metaphysics and science for all time has been focused on beings and missed the question of being, right? So beings is like, you could think of it as the total collection of things that exist. Those are beings. And how do we get to being from that? Do we just add it all up and say, well, this is being? No, that's not how we get to it, because everything that exists in some way has being. But we don't encounter being directly. We don't encounter being. The hammer exists, but we don't counter its beingness. We encounter it as a being, right? And the main way that science, or Husserl even for that matter, will encounter the hammer is what he calls present at hand, Vorhandenheit, present at handness, you could call it. So that's when it appears for you as an isolated object, not in relation to nothing else. It appears as an object, and it has properties, and it's self-sufficient. What Heidegger wants to get to is a second mode of being, what he calls Zuhandenheit, which is ready to hand. This second mode of being, what he will eventually describe as the being of equipment and the being of tools, what we were talking about, the soccer player, the hammer, and all that stuff. But the important point about these things is that they exist in equipmental totalities. They do not exist as singular objects. The hammer does not exist without the nails to be hammered into. The nails in the hammer don't exist without wood and houses to be built, right? The carpenter doesn't exist without all of this equipmental totality. That's the important part about Zuhandenheit, which is ready to hand. When you're just going about your day and you're using objects, right? You use your door to open it. You throw your blankets off in the morning, right? Those things don't appear to you as present at hand. That's what we mean when we say you don't have to think about it. I don't have to think about when I'm, even now today, when I'm starting up my computer, I'm getting the podcast ready, like nothing's coming at me present as hand and I'm saying, oh, this is a substance with these properties and I have to do this. They're not self-sufficient substances. These things exist in this mode of equipmental totality. Right? So it's not just what it means to the person. That's wrong. It's how it exists in a sort of totality and how it exists in a sort of network. I like to think of it as a network or a system of other things that make that thing what it is too, right? So again, like I said, the hammer is not a hammer without nails. The nails in the hammer aren't anything without wood and without houses to be built, without people who need shelter, without humans who need somewhere to dwell, right? There's a sort of totality to Heidegger that he's trying to think of as well. So it would be wrong just to think of it as like what it means to the Dasein, or like that the Dasein doesn't have to think about it. Those are there. And of course, like you can't have ready to handness without present at handness. There's in some way they presuppose each other, but ready to handness doesn't depend on something being appearing to you present at hand. So that's the important point. So all these beings we're thinking about, if we get away from this present at handness, where things appear as representations of objects, and we get to this sort of second mode of being with this ready to handness, this Zuhandenheit, right? When we get there, then we're dealing with the world. Then we're in there coping. We are embodied and skilled beings who cope with the world. And yeah, in a way, we don't have to think about it. I don't think that's the decisive point, whether or not we have to think about it when we use stuff, right? Like if I'm opening the door and suddenly someone pushes on the other side and slams it shut in my face, like, okay, something would come present at hand. Something would jump out at me then, and I have to step back and think, well, what the hell happened? This thing's broken down. It's not working as it should. It's not allowing me to enter into my other part of my house. Something's gone wrong. But that, I don't think the decisive question is whether or not you have to think about it, and I don't think the decisive question here is whether or not what it means to be a carpenter. Like, to be a carpenter already implies this equipmental totality that we can enter into, right?
I was going to say, I agree with you largely, right? But I do think that there's a bit of a normative emphasis here that is implicit, to go back to the terms we used prior to the discussion within the earlier Heidegger, but becomes a lot more explicit later on, right? Because what the Project of Being and Time kind of presents itself as a purely philosophical anthropology, right? Where it's just describing the way that Dasein apprehends the world in its kind of historicity, right? But later on, in later Heidegger, it's pretty clear that he gives a critical edge to this by saying that one of the problems with the modern epoch is precisely this regression to an outlook that stresses thinghood, beings over the question of being, right? And this tends to frame our relationship to the world in a certain way that's deeply problematic. And this is where you get all of his stuff on technology and the problems with modernity. And while it's not as clearly explicated in this book, a lot of these concerns are there, particularly I think when you look at the later sections on the problem of authenticity in the world of the they, or das Man, right?
I think the important difference between being and beings always remains, though. This is the other word. When you encounter these words, you'll see ontology, which is the question of being, and you'll see ontic, which is beings, plural, right? So what Heidegger will later say is what it gets lost is the ontological difference. What's the difference between beings as a sort of total of what exists and being, like the fact of existence, right? And I think that's the reason that it's hermeneutic and not descriptive, is because we encounter being everywhere, but it's sort of concealed. It's hidden in beings, right? And in order to get to it, we have to perform this sort of, not a phenomenological reduction, like Husserl would call it, the epoche or the epoche, where we get rid of our own biases and we sort of step out of the world and we're able to look in from the outside without any of those pesky sorts of biases of the subject getting in our way. Instead, for Heidegger, that's impossible. You can't do that. You're always, that's the principle of thrownness we were talking about, is Dasein is always there being. That's why it's Dasein, their being. He's always there, or she is always there. I think Heidegger only used he, among beings, dealing with these beings. And then Dasein becomes a kind of third type of being on top of present at hand, ready to hand, and then you have Dasein. And then later on in his career, in the 40s and the 50s, he comes up with the work of art and the thingness. And maybe you could think of those as fourth and fifth types of being that he wants to talk about. You know, art as the presencing of truth, and thing, meaning, you know, a gathering of concerned beings around some kind of thing. That's why, you know, you can go to Iceland and you can still find one of the government buildings is called the All Thing, because that's what thing used to mean. It used to mean a gathering of people over some issue that concerns everybody, right? So he comes up with all these differences of modes of being. And the important point is, I guess, to get away from that sort of present at handness, where everything appears as objects over and against some kind of subject. And we got to get away from this way of thinking about things. And it's kind of fun because you can look around at the world and you can kind of do these thought experiments with Heidegger that you can't really do with other philosophers in certain ways, right? Like, how are you going to do a thought experiment with like absolute spirit? It's like, what is that going to look like? I don't know. But
Start
I know,
a revolution.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, go read Marx. That's what it looks like. But I don't know. When you're reading Heidegger, it's kind of like, yeah, I am thrown into this world and I'm coping with things using my inherent skills and abilities. And sometimes things go wrong and they appear present at hand to me. But most of the time, you know, I'm not aware of it. I'm wearing my glasses. I got my headphones on. I'm not thinking about those things. But the point is that glasses wouldn't be glasses without lenses and lens makers and this whole equipmental totality. And the same can go with everything, with glasses and headphones and computers. It all exists in this sort of total. And that's sort of the important point to get across early on, is, I guess, this difference as well between being and beings. And you'll often see being capitalized, which is very silly because it shouldn't be capitalized. The only reason it's capitalized is because in German, all nouns are capitalized. So it's always capital. Beings would be capitalized. Being would be capitalized. There's no difference there. So the English translation kind of fucks things up when it tries to capitalize being in order to make that distinction.
That point about equipmentality, though, my recollection or my reading of it, you know, is, yeah, like that network kind of analysis of things, like that definitely is an aspect of it. But I always remember equipmentality being much more related to just like a connection to like how Dasein is a project, right? It's projecting itself, and like the equipmentality is used in assistance to Dasein's projects, right? So like, when you're using a hammer to build a house, you're not thinking about the hammer, right, as a present at hand. And by the way, like an interesting side note, like the Stombaugh translation doesn't use present at hand; it uses objectively there, which I think is trying to more emphasize the way that like present at hand really means like you're rendering it into like an isolated object. So like objectively there, like it's you're almost abstracting it. You're turning it into like an abstract entity rather than just something that is being used in your project. Like, you're not thinking about the hammer, you're thinking about building the house, or your next steps, or what you're going to do with your body to move in that way. And in a way you're not, and then it's like, but I guess the reason.
So this is what you're describing, I'll just tell it, is what Heidegger calls the in order to. That's what he describes.
Right, exactly.
The in order to.
So, but let me just finish quickly. So like, you know, the equipment, I guess like, like the network analysis though, to me seems more like turning what equipment is into a kind of objectively there object when you start thinking about it in that sense. Like, I guess because I guess I want to make a distinction between like that network analysis of how like objects only exist in their relation to other objects, which kind of seems like you're turning it into an abstraction, as opposed to just Dasein doing its projects in the world, and it's not thinking about how this book needed to have like a tree and lumber farms, right? It's just doing its shit. It's reading the book, or it's. So I don't know, like, is it like how, like, because that seems like an important.
I want to like riff on what you're saying, because I actually tend to agree with you, Victor. Although I also agree with Eric that like the more holistic way of reading Heidegger is the way he articulated. I think one of the problems here is actually hermeneutic, because when we read Being in Time, I think it is much more a book about a certain kind of phenomenological approach to the human being that does stress individuated projects in the world and one's experience of time. Which is probably why it's best considered a work of existential phenomenology that inspired many other existential phenomenologists, right? Heidegger seems to back away from this in exactly the way Eric described, starting from the 1930s going forward, by stressing the kind of historicity and embeddedness of Dasein in various ways of life, right? And this is where a lot of the critique of modernity comes in and so on and so forth. But it's just important to mention, since we seem to be stressing being in time, that I think the more appropriate one is the one that interpretation of that book specifically is the one that you're giving. Victor?
Yeah, he also calls that objective appearance you were saying, sometimes it gets translated as occurrence as well. In the original, I think the best translation, that original Macquarie and Robinson one, they do call it ready to hand, present at hand, with the hyphens.
Yeah, it's funny. In this one, it's ready to hand, but then objectively there.
It's the difference between theoretical behavior and practical behavior, right? When you're behaving practically in the world, you're but you got to be careful not to import, again, metaphysical concepts. Purpose is a metaphysical concept that has no place in Heidegger's system. You're not using something to do something in a sort of metaphysical sense. Like the way Heidegger is going to put this is that whenever you use a hammer with a goal in mind, you subordinate your concern to in order to, and you subordinate that concern. But then he makes a distinction between an in order to, which kind of has a terminus in something, and then an in order to, which is just doing again. So he kind of makes all these distinctions, and he wants you to be careful not to import these ideas of subjective desires and goals and things we project in the world, in the sense that of being a subject outside of the world.
Although he talks a lot about those things.
I just want to at least try to summarize, because we're going into, we'll put it up as is, but there's so much term dropping, and I know there has to be term dropping, but if we could stick to maybe a single example and just carry it through, that might be a better way to do this.
I was going to say, maybe what we could do, just for the purposes of Being in Time, since that seems to be the focus right now, is give our quick 2-minute interpretation of what we think the key points of the book are. Because I think that would be where the differences in our interpretation of what's key would come out most clearly. Because I'm starting to get a sense that we all have different approaches to it, where I would stress the kind of existential interpretation of the book. I get the sense that Eric might be a little bit more inclined towards a hermeneutic interpretation, and just because of the emphasis on the subject, it seems to me like, Victor, you're a little bit more prone to an existential phenomenological interpretation. Is that fair to say?
For sure. That's how I learned it. I learned it from somebody who was also an existential phenomenologist.
Exactly. So
I think Heidegger is phenomenological, existential.
Okay, well, I'll open this up. I'll play the role of host and try to open this up. So Heidegger brings up at one point the definition of object, and it's interesting that we have these words. I don't know what they are in German, but in English,
Gegenstand is object, something that stands against.
He talks about an object as if you put it down in front of you and then are banging your head into it, sort of.
Yeah, Gegenstand.
And that only happens in a world where usually things are going wrong. Because we're so habituated, we have habits about the world. You can think about when you're driving and you can, even though you're doing very complex actions with your body, you can separate your thoughts and then start daydreaming about what you're going to do later that evening when you're driving, even though these actions are all very complicated. So they become incorporated and embodied until someone slams on their brakes in front of you. And now that car is an object, and now it becomes a problem. So the object, it's a resistance to your experience.
But please watch the road if you're listening to this in the car.
Oh, that is a good movie.
Well, the fact that you can listen to this in the car sort of shows that embodied sense that we're talking about with Heidegger. So why don't we, we're actually all saying similar things about the book, but coming at it from, there's kind of 4 Heideggers at least, and we're each kind of taking on one Heidegger. So
the real Heidegger, please stand up, right?
Yeah, the problem is
we just articulate
except for the Nazi Heidegger, he can stay silent.
Why don't we go around with a time limit and just try to get out the thing that you think other people aren't getting about what you're saying, or the thing that you think is most important. And we'll start with Matt.
Okay. Well, I have to say, just to give my own kind of existential interpretation of Heidegger, there's a lot that the other two are going to cover that I think is very important, so I won't get into that. What I take away from it is this, right? That Heidegger has this very profound interpretation of the human experience of time that he lifts in some way from Soren Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and others, but reconceives in a very innovative and very systematic way that you don't find in those earlier two authors, right? And skip out a lot of the stuff, but basically there's this idea that we inhabit and we have an ecstatic relationship to time, as it appears at least to us phenomenologically.
Can you explain ecstatic? You've said it a bunch of times.
Well, the ecstatic idea of time that he refers to is the fact that we shouldn't conceive of time linearly as a sequence of moments, right? But rather as essentially Dasein being gripped or at the epicenter of the experience of the present and past, both tearing him or her in different directions, right? Because our projects are in some sense determined historically by what it is that we've inherited from our past, and of course our objectives at any given moment, and our hopes for the future, right? I'm not using the technical terminology, right? The example I gave earlier is, the soccer player, right? Who sits there and thinks like, well, this is how the game has gone thus far. This is what I have to do right now. This is what I hope to do with the game going forward, right? But where this becomes existential is the fact, of course, that he says that Dasein's ecstatic experience of time is finite, right? It's going to come to an end because all of us are being towards death in a certain way. And rather than acknowledge that, because it generates a tremendous sense of angst, which is a term he picks up from Kierkegaard's The Concept of Anxiety, we fall into the world of what he calls das Man, or the they, as it's sometimes translated, right? Which is essentially a way of hiding from our finitude by essentially replicating the activities of those that we see all around us. And because Heidegger is a critic of modernity, he doesn't much like that. And what he says that we need to do instead is to recognize the finitude of time that's available to us. And this is, again, a very Nietzschean idea, so that we can commit ourselves authentically to projects that can provide a sense of structural unity to our lives as a whole. Now, what those projects should be, he's never really very clear on. And I think it becomes kind of dark later on when you think about the kind of projects he thinks that we should commit ourselves to. But stripping away the politics of this, I think it's quite a resonant idea, right? And one of the ways that this was expressed to me was, again, with reference to Kierkegaard's work, where Kierkegaard would say, there are a lot of things that can give your life a kind of epicenter of meaning, projects that are that important. Some of them might be love, some of them might be philosophy, some of them might be aesthetic, right? You really want to create the great masterwork of Western poetry or Western literature, and you always aspire towards that. But the problem, of course, is that these will never fully come to fruition because of the finitude of time available to us. Finitude of physical time, not ecstatic time.
All right, Victor.
Okay. I agree with a lot of what Matt said. I mean, that's a part of that is a lot of that is my takeaway as well. Like, I do tend to emphasize the way the analysis of Dasein reveals the vulnerability of Dasein, or like human beings, to fall into these kinds of conditions of bad faith where we ignore our condition as a finite being projected forward. And I think the most important aspect for me is the upshot, I guess, of it is authenticity, which we haven't really talked about. So maybe I'll just talk about that briefly. For Heidegger, authenticity is not like some commonsensical, stupid pop cultural idea of being authentic, but it's actually just like taking seriously and taking it up in your being somehow as much as possible. This existential structure of Dasein, which is like the being towards death, the way we're influenced and the way we are always fleeing from our destiny to be being towards death, and the way we try to cover that over with all these everydayness, all these structures and ideas that we have, and we're trying to ignore that. And authenticity, he uses this attitude, he calls it anticipatory resoluteness. It's like this attitude where Dasein tries to take up this truth that we're being towards death and that we're always trying to flee from things and hide things with our by falling prey to the Das Man, which basically just means being influenced by the crowd and whatever the culture or other people or your friends happen to be saying. And I think I actually have like a quote here that I think captures it kind of nicely. I've always liked this one. He's talking about how Dasein is always ambiguously there, that is, in the public disclosedness of being with one another, which means being with other people, like the being influenced by the crowd. And he says, where the loudest idle talk and the most inventive curiosity keeps the business going, where everything happens in an everyday way, and basically nothing happens at all. And like this is in some ways exemplifying the existential analysis of Heidegger, where he's showing that we're just getting our minds lost in this nonsense and like gossip and all these things. And it's like I think authentic being for him would be somehow, as much as possible, pushing those things aside. But I think one of the tragedies in Heidegger, or the tragedy of the truth of Dasein, is that even Heidegger himself says like authenticity is an impossible attitude to keep going at all times, because in fact, the whole point of his analysis of Dasein is that a fundamental feature of Dasein is that we're prone to fall prey, is that we're prone to like fall victim to the idle talk. It's impossible to not do that. That's going to happen no matter what. And you will just have these little moments, these flashes of your anticipatory resoluteness where you can be authentic, but it's a moment. And the rest of the time you're going to fall prey to the nonsense. And that to me is like is the upshot of being in time.
Just to riff on that for 1 second, this is, I think, why Zizek used to say that Heidegger is one of the few philosophers that you can find in the 20th century who resolutely has no sense of humor, right? Because there's this very severe attitude in him. It's like anticipatory resolutionist about, the fundamental projects of your existence and all that stuff, and you should dismiss idle chatter. And it's like, well, a lot of humor is idle chatter, right?
Exactly. And actually, just quickly, there's like one other quote which captures this too. It's like, everyday publicness of the they, which brings tranquilized self-assurance, being at home with all its obviousness, into the average everydayness of Dasein. Anxiety, on the other hand, fetches Dasein back out of its entangled absorption in the world. Everyday familiarity collapses. So this is like describing those little moments, those ruptures where you realize the anxiety, but I guess the anticipatory resoluteness and real authenticity would be in a way of taking up that anxiety in a way that, gives you some control over it for a moment at least, or makes you more aware of it in this deliberate way rather than just reacting with anxiety and dread, I suppose.
So I think Eric and I should still take our lecture turn, but I think this is quite interesting because we do a lot of leftist stuff, and Heidegger is almost a crotchety sounding individualist, extolling, ruggedness and independence in the same way that Nietzsche or Sartre do. So I wondered if you guys see any tension in that, this almost anti-collective attitude. And the irony here, for me at least, is the fact that he got swept up into Nazism after writing these words.
Well, I don't think it's particularly individualist in the way that he interpreted it. And this is actually where I push back on this, because you could find a radical reading of this pretty easily, right? By saying that, and a lot of ideology theorists have, right? By saying that one of the reasons why it is that we fall into the world of thus modern idle chatter is precisely because we're trying to advance our social capital. So the fundamental problem is capitalism and the kind of socioeconomic relations that it establishes. He doesn't go that route, right? Instead, he turns to this project of collective national renewal and the importance of participating in the ongoing project of Germanification of Europe. We could talk about that more next time if you want, because I know we're trying to put an X through his politics right now. But I think that's really unfortunate, because I think there are much more interesting radical and leftist ways of interpreting his work that people, for instance, like Marcuse engage in, right?
I agree fundamentally with Matt here. I think I personally even have always read Being in Time, and as much as I've been sympathetic to some of Biener from the Biener episode, I still ultimately think that Being in Time is pretty neutral. Like there's totally a way of reading thrownness and like Das Mann and all that stuff in a very progressive way. You could read like the fact that Dasein is so vulnerable to all these things, so subject to its condition, as implying, I think, some kind of progressive politics, because it's like you can't blame, if anything, it's like it's actually an argument against some weird individualist political philosophy that says people have the power to pull themselves up from their bootstraps, because this whole book is talking about how fucking impossible that is. How you're always going to fall prey to shit, and how you're always even he says, authenticity is incredibly hard to grasp. So it does actually very much go against this idea that we're like, rational agents who can just like take up our position and be responsible, right? Like I don't think that follows from this. All
right. And there's kind of an analysis of power possible from that perspective too. But
absolutely,
I digress. Absolutely. Let's turn to Eric for his lecture series.
I think all I really want to say is Heidegger comes up with the idea that existence precedes essence, and that basically means that
Sartre?
It's popularized by Sartre, but it's
it's in here.
It's in Being and Time. You can hit Control F and type it in there.
Right.
But is it existence with a K or existence with an X?
It's existentia, like the Latin term.
Oh, okay.
Which precedes essentia. Existentia precedes essentia, which basically means that the. I mean, I guess it's not there's nothing to say basically about Heidegger, but existence preceding essence is the heart of the phenomenological method and the ontology that he wants to bring out is essences. When things have essences, you're identifying what makes things what they are in the abstract. So you're not like, you see 100 dogs out there, for example, and then you think, but what is the essence of the dog? And that's okay, you think that way, and that's perfectly fine, and you might make some amazing discoveries through thinking about like, what is the essence of the dog? The dog is not the cat, therefore we can make them into seeing eye dogs. So like you can make some, but really, I mean, I actually like the example dogs because humans have evolved alongside dogs for thousands and thousands of years, and they really are a fundamental part of our being as Dasein as well. And their existence in that sense of their being, being in the sense of ontology is not just a property of beings, because again, then you're sliding back into the metaphysical worldview. With existence preceding essence means that things are before they are what they are. They eke out their existence in a certain way. They cut their character into being before they become what they are in a certain way. You can't say what something is before it's going to appear to you. And that's a kind of an important idea. I think even Kant says the idea that being is not a property of things. But for Heidegger, he makes a really important point of that. Yeah, and like you said, it's popularized by the later phenomenological existentialists who talk about the same sorts of things. Is that we got to look at what things are, like in their being, before we know what they are in the abstract, in their essence, and fall back into a metaphysics.
For 1 second by saying this is exactly why I think he had such an influence on so many post-structuralists like Derrida, right? Because there's this real critique of representational thinking as saying, this simply is what it is. We can define that.
No, you're
detached from other considerations.
Yeah,
right?
it complicates the notion of identity because we just think we know what things are when we look at them. Like I know the essence of man, I know the essence of woman, and therefore like I can always identify a man and a woman. But it kind of problematizes the idea of an identity, of what a thing is. If its existence precedes its essence, if its being in the world precedes our ability to say sort of what it is in every case, then I don't know how to say it. Like what it seems to suggest is we need a radical new approach to the way we think about the world. And I think that's what Heidegger is trying to bring to us. And I'm saying all I want to say there. That's it.
Yeah.
All right.
Go ahead. Yeah. Go.
Thank you. Look, I don't know if you guys, I don't know what the edit sounds like yet, but if it sounds clean, that's because I have cut out all the places where we are constantly interrupting each other, because everyone seems to be really excited about this topic, even though we've only covered the first half of Being in Time and sparsely.
You wanted conflict. Be careful what you wish for, bitch.
Well, I've been sitting back, but I notice that each of you are interpreting this book kind of exactly how I'd expect you to. So Victor is taking the phenomenological approach. Sounds like you've read a lot of Dreyfus or whatever.
Some. Merleau-Ponty too. Yeah.
Or Merleau-Ponty. And Eric is harping on the divide between subject and object completely. And Matt is all about historicity and projects. Well, I'm using it a little
harping.
I'm going to bring it. I'll bring it to my zone because typically
I don't harp ever. Fuck you.
You hate the subject object. Eric, you hate the subject object divide more than any person I've ever met. This is like your passion project. Anyway, we have not talked about language yet. Heidegger has a book called On the Way to Language, a book called Poetry, Language, Thought, an essay called On Language, and none of this really is developed in Being and Time, but maybe I can give sort of a preview of the direction that this could take. Because the way I read Heidegger is much more hermeneutic in the sense that he's the first person, and I think there's a history of technics argument to be made in here, because the microphone and the radio, kind of what we talked about last week in a McLuhan sense, came out during Heidegger's time. So for me, an interesting thing that I haven't studied yet, and I'm saying it because no one's really brought it up yet, but would be that text seems transparent, and especially texts of philosophy seem to be about the thing that they're about rather than the process of reading or rather than the process of writing. And Heidegger and Derrida following him is one of the first people to really notice how important text and writing is to the way that you see the world, and particularly in terms of Dasein, because what is more present to hand and ready to hand at the same time than reading a book? You forget that you're reading a book while you're reading it, and it looks like you're seeing this whole invisible world of beings, even though this is like a page in front of you physically, a page in front of you. So I think we can talk about this a bit if you guys are interested in this dimension, but to me, Heidegger's the first person who stopped seeing the text as transparent, stopped seeing it as a window, and seeing it as this mechanism by which Dasein discovers itself, really. Yeah. And in terms of the world of objects, we're talking about hammers, we're talking about soccer, but in the world of Dasein, for him, text is like the most important object that we could have. And I think if we were to develop Heidegger phenomenologically, the effect of phones, keyboards, computers, microphones, all of this stuff on the life world would have a huge output in terms of understanding like what it does to us and how we do it and how we are along with these objects. Anyway,
is that like to say that? Is that to say like at the way that we talk about stuff or how we talk about something is at least as important as like what we're talking about?
Yeah.
I guess that's the kind of point there. Pills.
Yeah, and I'd like to move forward from that a little bit, just to say that first of all, I think that Wittgenstein's approach to language is considerably more sophisticated than Heidegger's is, but I think that they get at a lot of the same things. But rather than emphasizing the things that I think they get the same, one of the things that I think is really innovative about his approach to language is how he takes this almost archaeological approach to it, in the sense that he says, we tend to objectify the world in a certain way through the terms that we use, by saying, as you know, a lot of us have put it, and Eric especially, that this is what it is because it has this kind of essential quality to it, or there are essential features that we ascribe to it. And what he does really innovatively, and this is where his philological background comes in, is by saying, well, when we talk about things like being, like thinghood, or when we talk about things like poetry, or when we talk about things like economy, what are the roots of those words? And he looks through their history and says, well, this determines a little bit about why we ascribe this essence to those words in the way that we do in certain practices. And it's not always clear to me how this should be interpreted, because sometimes he refers to the kind of house of being that is language as a gift that we inherit, and the kind of essentializations that we make about the world and being as a whole and the beings within it as something we should be grateful for, right? Because how would we make sense of the world without it? Right? But at other points, he seems to be a lot more critical of this, particularly when it comes to the kind of way that we interpret modernity, because he sometimes will say that, well, the kind of essentialisms that we invoke when it comes to different objects in the world and regarding them as things, and our language reflects this, is debased, and it doesn't allow them to be unconcealed as what they are in the holism of being. And this is precisely why we need to problematize the way that we use language right now in a way that only things like poetry are actually capable of. And when in that kind of sense, I think that actually Derrida is very much his spiritual heir in kind of poetically deconstructing the history of essentialisms that we see and the way that they're used in everyday life right now, and showcasing how there were other possibilities that might have been available to us and might once again be available to us if only we have the kind of reflection to make them, bring them to consciousness in a way that they weren't before.
Language is the house of being. In it we dwell. Yeah, it's important. Yeah, I think another an important image too to get out of it is the tree of knowledge that Heidegger wants to go against. You can picture the ground as what Heidegger wants to get to, and the tree of knowledge is metaphysics. And you have the trunk of the tree that, like, one day humans planted this seed, and it grew into a tree, and it became the tree of knowledge. And its roots are in the ground, and its trunk and all that is like a moral philosophy, and the branches are natural philosophy and the sciences. And then the branches kind of poke out, but they never get back to the ground. There's never a questioning of what they're grounded on. And in a sense, Heidegger wants to go back down the tree into the ground, away from metaphysics, and towards the ground of being, where everything is, what grounds everything is their being. And Heidegger wants to get back to that. And the metaphysician could just say to Heidegger, oh, well, you're just doing the opposite of what Hegel is doing, who's trying to ascend to the heights of metaphysics, and you're just going back down. And then Heidegger's rejoinder to that would be, well, if you see it that way, then you're still caught up in the tradition of metaphysics and you're not seeing things correctly. That just appears to be what I'm doing. But what I'm really doing is trying to sweep away that entire tree of knowledge. And I don't know what he wants to put in his place. Probably not like a rhizome or something like that, like Deleuze and Guattari do, but he wants to sweep it all away.
Schizoanalysis, baby.
Well, that's actually a part that I always had trouble with Heidegger. Is like, well, what do you want to replace it with? Like, it's, you know.
Well, I mean, that's always, what about the cost, man? What about the cost? That's always the question.
I think I don't
can't afford to pull out all these trees.
It might be in Being and Time, actually, because like ultimately, like, I don't actually think he wants to, like, totally overturn all that stuff. I think he just wants it to be relabeled for what it is, right? Like, he would want science to just be like relabeled that it's not doing what it thinks it's doing. It's like doing something else, which is like related to like Dasein's projects towards some, like, some end, but it's not doing anything fundamental.
Yeah, it's obviously important. I think you're absolutely right about that. But like, in some ways, this sort of metaphysical view that science is grounded in produces instrumentality. And that's why when he talks about technology, he talks about the way that science treats the world as a standing reserve, and the way that everything becomes object for us. It has no, I guess it has essence. So it's fungible, it's replaceable in a certain way. So what happens is you treat the world as a reserve out of which to make things as, goals in your project. Like, you're importing this purpose to humanity into your thinking, and you're saying, well, okay, everything should be serving that purpose. So, animals are expendable, the environment is expendable, the entire earth is just a resource for us to use in our projects. And you get this instrumentalism that, I guess, comes out really later in Heidegger's work after the technology question essay, and it's actually led to some kind of environmental interpretations of Heidegger too. Everyone keeps that in mind in the later Heidegger, that he doesn't like this view science based on techne, where it's just an instrumentalist kind of thing. He wants it again to be consolidated to his phenomenological existentialism, where existence precedes essence.
All right.
And instead,
Perfect place to end. You circled back exactly to the place where we started. So we have, if we do an episode 2, that's not a promise, but if we do Heidegger part 2, then we can deal with the language and the technology question.
I think we should. I mean, we barely scratched the surface of this one, and I think it's very clear that we have a lot of enthusiasm for the fine.
We might want to be more organized next time. Maybe I feel like the first half of this was like a little bit of a mess, and hopefully you do some editing there, Pills. But
it's too instrumental to think that we need a plan for these, you know.
Yeah.
All we're doing is creating a clearing in the minds of our listeners while they're driving to their instrumental jobs.
Maybe they'll enjoy you yelling at us to stop interrupting each other.
Well, I'll leave one in. I'll leave one.
You'll edit out the shrieks.
But it's like, it's whenever there's a lull, then everyone's like, and then whoever like talks loudest then gets to keep going.
I got the best mic, so that's me.
Well, anyway, we got to get to Heidegger's cabin next time. Why did he retreat from technology other than getting kicked out of school because he was a Nazi?
Yeah, why are there so many pictures of him chopping wood and drawing water out of wells? What a freak.
Yeah, and who took those pictures? Like, he wouldn't use a typewriter, but he's like, hey, bro, take my picture. I need to show everybody how earthy I am. How rooted I am.
At that cabin.
He calls his books like path marks, and you can just picture him walking around the woods like, oh, I'm a mountain man in the cuckoo woods.
Do you guys know anything about Buddhism? Because there's actually a lot of interesting connections to the fourfold and Buddhism, and apparently he had some Buddhist students as well.
I know a little bit, but not very much.
You can pick up like the Tao Te Ching and find phrases that seem to be just like imported directly into Heidegger's books, so it's definitely important for him.
He might have plagiarized, we don't know. Anyway, thanks, Victor, Matt, and Eric.
Thank you, Pills.
We hope you guys...
Thank you for your wisdom and your bringing us to this great place.
I didn't do much wisdom. It was more like babysitting today.
Your authority and your discipline. You were truly Foucault's wet dream today.
Thank you for your disciplined leadership.
I was shepherding being into a comprehensible form for you.
Thank you for shepherding.
Really reminded me that we were in a lockdown.
I had to shepherd your language. If we were in person, I could just turn off your mic. But all right, thanks everybody. Hope you liked it. Peace.
Thank you.